was a moment I could never take back, Jake Thompson admitted, his eyes downcast as he stood before the court. The words hung in the air, heavy with regret and finality, yet too late for any apology to undo the damage. The courtroom fell silent as those present realized the gravity of what had unfolded. Jake, a seemingly ordinary man, had been thrust into a situation that would forever change his life and the lives of his victims. His chilling confession opened a door to a story that was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. The crime, a tragedy that began with an argument, would spiral into a series of events that shocked the entire community, leaving a trail of grief, unanswered questions, and ultimately, death. What followed was a relentless pursuit of justice, but for the families affected, there would never be a clean resolution. Roy Lee Ward was not a man who could easily be dismissed. His presence in the small community of Indiana went unnoticed by most until it was too late. But for the victim's family, he would become a name they could never forget. Stacy Payne had no reason to believe her life was in danger when she first encountered Ward. He had been a fixture in the community for years, someone who blended into the background like so many others. But deep within, Ward harbored dark secrets, crimes committed in shadows, hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. It started on a quiet afternoon in the small town, the sort of day that felt like any other. Stacy, a young woman with a bright future, found herself in the company of someone she had no reason to fear. Trusting the wrong person, Stacy paid the ultimate price. Ward's attack on Stacy was swift and brutal. It was the kind of thing no one could have predicted. There were no signs, no clues that would have tipped off anyone in the community. He did everything right. Ward had a way of gaining trust, of blending into the background just enough to make others feel comfortable. It was a quiet, methodical approach, which made the crime all the more shocking when it came to light. Her final moments were ones of terror, though they would never be fully known to those around her. But her family was left to pick up the pieces, their world shattered by the loss of someone who should have been safe. The grief Stacy's family experienced was unimaginable. The community rallied around them, but nothing would ever bring their daughter, sister, and friend back. What had once been a quiet place was now forever marked by tragedy. Roy Lee Ward's criminal history wasn't a long one, but it was enough to set the stage for what would happen. He didn't start out as a notorious criminal, but as the events surrounding Stacy Payne's death unfolded, it became clear that Ward was a man whose violent tendencies had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. His long criminal record had been kept under wraps. Ward had a history of minor offenses, but nothing that could have warned anyone of the violence he was capable of. He had a way of living on the fringes, never standing out, always keeping just enough distance from the law to avoid raising suspicion. Before the crime, Ward had been a man who blended into the fabric of his community, a seemingly harmless figure who could strike up a conversation with anyone. But behind that facade was a mind capable of planning something dark. By the time he found Stacy Payne, Ward had already made up his mind about what he would do. The attack was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was calculated, a chillingly deliberate act. The motive behind Ward's crime remained unclear for some time. Some speculated that he was simply a product of his troubled past, while others believed that it was an opportunity that had presented itself. Whatever the reason, Ward's actions would not be easily forgiven. He had taken someone's life, and now it was up to the justice system to hold him accountable for the horror he had caused. The investigation into Stacy Payne's death began in the wake of the discovery of her body. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that something was terribly wrong, but even with the pieces falling into place, the investigation was anything but straightforward. The small town that had once been so peaceful was now gripped with fear. The sheriff's department was on high alert, trying to make sense of what had happened. Ward, the man who seemed so harmless, quickly became the prime suspect. But there was one question that loomed over the investigation. How could a man like Roy Lee Ward, someone who blended into the background so well, commit such a violent crime? The investigation focused on piecing together the moments leading up to Stacy's death. It was painstaking work, talking to those who had seen Ward in the days before, gathering evidence, and searching for any small clue that would point to the truth. As the sheriff's department dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern of behavior in Ward that was chilling. Ward was eventually apprehended, but not without a struggle. His arrest was marked by a moment of disbelief, as those who had known him could hardly believe the man they had seen every day was capable of such a crime. But once the evidence against him mounted, there was little that could save him from his fate. The emotional toll on the family was impossible to ignore. As news spread of Ward's arrest, Stacy's family was left to deal with the reality that the person responsible for their loved one's death was now in custody. It was a painful moment, but it also offered them a sliver of closure, something they had desperately needed. The trial was a long and emotional ordeal, as the families of both the victim and the perpetrator found themselves facing the harsh reality of what had happened. Ward's defense tried to argue that he was not responsible for his actions, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Stacy Payne's family, understandably, wanted justice, and they would not settle for anything less than a conviction. When the verdict was delivered, there was no celebration. Instead, there was a sense of relief, a heavy understanding that justice had been served, but that nothing could ever bring Stacy back. Ward's execution was the culmination of a long and painful journey for everyone involved. His final meal was a somber affair, and his last words were a quiet acknowledgement of his guilt. But those who had suffered most, the Payne family, were left to face the reality of the loss that could never be undone. The crime that shook the community in Florida was one that no one expected from a man who had long been seen as a pillar of his local church. Samuel Lee Smithers, a deacon by day, was a man who seemed to live a quiet, unremarkable life. But beneath the surface of this self-appointed model citizen lay a mind capable of committing heinous acts. It was the brutal murders of Denise Roach and Christy Cowan that revealed the dark secrets Samuel had carefully concealed for so long. The two women were victims of an unfathomable violence that seemed completely out of character for the man who had been seen as a respectable member of the community. His facade of normalcy, however, was shattered in the most violent of ways. The victims, both in their early 30s, had their lives tragically cut short by someone they had trusted. They had no reason to fear Samuel, a man who had been known for his church involvement and seemingly harmless demeanor, but the trust they placed in him became their downfall. In a single brutal act, Smithers took two lives, and the community was left to pick up the pieces of the horror that had unfolded. The crime was violent, a methodical execution that left no room for doubt in the minds of investigators. The victims were both stabbed multiple times, their bodies left in a state that revealed the true extent of Smithers' rage. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through the town, leaving the community in disbelief. How could someone who appeared so ordinary, so wholesome, be capable of something so unspeakable? Samuel Lee Smithers was a man who, for many years, wore the mask of a respectable churchgoer and pillar of the community. As a deacon, he held a position of authority and trust within the local congregation. People relied on him for guidance, comfort, and spiritual leadership. But behind the mask, Smithers was harboring a much darker side. Born and raised in a small town, Smithers had always been known as a quiet, somewhat reclusive figure. He lived a life that seemed to be by the book, attending church regularly, maintaining a low profile, and keeping to himself. But in the years leading up to the murders, it became clear that Smithers was struggling with deep internal turmoil. It wasn't just that he harbored violent tendencies, he had been concealing them for decades. The two women whom he killed were not random victims. Denise Roach and Christy Cowan had been close to Smithers, and both had trusted him. But that trust was ultimately betrayed in the most violent way possible. The crime wasn't just a spontaneous act of violence. It was part of a pattern, one that had been building for years. Smithers had a history of controlling relationships, and his interactions with the women had turned darker as time went on. Investigators would later uncover disturbing evidence of Smithers' obsession with power and control. The killings were not a moment of madness, but a calculated attempt to maintain authority over people he felt he could dominate. In many ways, his double life as a church deacon had enabled him to keep his true self hidden until it all came crashing down with the murders. The investigation into the murders of Denise Roach and Christy Cowan was one of shock and disbelief. The small community that had once looked up to Smithers as a man of faith and integrity was now left to confront the horrifying reality of what had transpired. The victims' families were devastated, but as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear that this crime was not random. It was personal. The initial investigation into the deaths was confusing, as there seemed to be no immediate motive. The murders appeared to have no connection to each other at first, but as detectives began piecing together the women's relationships with Smithers, a disturbing pattern emerged. Both victims had been close to Smithers. Both had trusted him, and both had been betrayed by him in the most violent way possible. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators found crucial evidence that linked Smithers directly to the crime scene. Forensic analysis and eyewitness testimony painted a picture of Smithers' involvement. At first, Smithers denied any involvement in the murders, but as the evidence mounted, his defense began to crumble. During the investigation, Smithers' behavior was analyzed in depth. His calm demeanor during the questioning, his seemingly unemotional responses, and his attempt to downplay the gravity of the situation led detectives to believe that he was not only guilty, but also showed little remorse for his actions. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Smithers had carefully planned the murders, premeditating the violence as a way to regain control over the women he had once dominated emotionally. The psychological aspect of the case was unsettling. Smithers' actions seemed to be rooted in a need to assert power, an unhealthy desire to maintain dominance over those he viewed as his possessions. His behavior was calculated, chilling, and deeply disturbing. The trial of Samuel Lee Smithers was a long and emotional process. For the families of Denise Roach and Christy Cowan, it was a painful journey toward justice. As the trial unfolded, Smithers' true nature came to light. His defense team tried to argue that his actions were the result of a mental breakdown, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Throughout the trial, Smithers' lack of remorse was evident. He showed no real emotion as the details of his victims' deaths were read aloud in the courtroom. For those who had once known him as a church deacon, the transformation from man of faith to cold-blooded killer was hard to comprehend. The community, once united by their faith, was now divided, with many struggling to reconcile the man they had once trusted with the brutal murderer he had become. In the end, Smithers was convicted of the double murder, and the emotional toll of his crimes was felt deeply by everyone involved. The families of the victims were left to grieve, but they found some solace in the knowledge that Smithers would be held accountable for his actions. His execution, though, would bring no true closure for those who had suffered so deeply. On the day of his execution, Smithers' final moments were marked by a sense of cold detachment. His last words were a muted apology to the families of the victims. But it was clear that he had never truly understood the weight of his crimes. For the families of Denise and Christy, however, his death was a final chapter in a long and painful story. A chapter that would never erase the pain they had endured, but at least it would bring an end to the man who had caused it all. The shooting of Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham Jr. by Lance Colin Shockley marked a tragic turning point in the law enforcement community. For years, Sergeant Graham had served his community with dedication and respect, becoming a symbol of bravery and duty. His death was not only a blow to his family, but to an entire town that relied on the safety and protection he provided. The man responsible for his death was Lance Colin Shockley, a man with a history of anger and disdain for law enforcement. The crime that shocked Missouri was a calculated ambush, leaving the community in mourning and struggling to come to terms with the senseless violence that had occurred. Shockley's motivations for gunning down Sergeant Graham were rooted in a deep-seated resentment toward the police. He had been arrested and incarcerated in the past for a series of crimes, and his interactions with law enforcement had been far from positive. Shockley had grown increasingly hostile toward authority figures, particularly those in law enforcement, and had made threats to officers in the past. But no one could have predicted the violence that would unfold on that fateful day. On the morning of the attack, Sergeant Graham was responding to a routine call when he unknowingly crossed paths with Shockley. What followed was an ambush that left the officer dead and Shockley on the run. The details of the crime were horrifying. Shockley fired multiple shots at close range, killing the officer before fleeing the scene. The community was left in shock as a once respected member of society had turned into a cold-blooded killer. Lance Colin Shockley was a man with a troubled past, filled with run-ins with the law and a history of violent behavior. Born into a world of hardship, Shockley had developed a deep mistrust of authority figures, particularly law enforcement. He had been arrested multiple times for various offenses, including violent crimes, but had never been able to stay out of trouble for long. Shockley's relationship with law enforcement was fraught with animosity. He often expressed his hatred for the police, believing that they were responsible for his personal struggles and his criminal record. Shockley's distrust of the system grew as he faced more legal battles, and he became increasingly bitter toward anyone associated with the justice system. As Shockley's anger festered, so did his sense of entitlement. He believed that law enforcement officers, like Sergeant Graham, were responsible for his inability to lead a normal life. He had a warped sense of justice, where retaliation against the police became the only way to regain control of his life. His motivations for killing Sergeant Graham were rooted in this toxic mindset. Shockley wanted to prove a point, to show that he could strike back at the system that had wronged him. In the years leading up to the crime, Shockley's behavior had escalated, and he had made several violent threats against officers. However, his rage was not just directed at police. It was part of a broader resentment toward society and the way he had been treated. Shockley's life was marked by failure and frustration, and he believed that the only way to find release was through violence. The investigation into the murder of Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham Jr. was intense and thorough. Law enforcement agencies from all over the state joined forces to track down Shockley, who had quickly become a fugitive. The hunt for Shockley was a manhunt like no other. Officers were on high alert, knowing that Shockley was not only dangerous but also determined to avoid capture. The investigation was difficult because Shockley was a master of evasion. He knew how to stay off the radar and blend into the shadows, but law enforcement was relentless in their pursuit. The breaking point came when Shockley made a mistake. In his desperate attempt to evade capture, he reached out to acquaintances for help, which ultimately led investigators to his whereabouts. Shockley's attempts to remain hidden were futile as the net tightened around him. In the months following Sergeant Graham's death, Shockley's psychological state was examined closely. His refusal to cooperate during interrogations and his apparent lack of remorse painted a chilling picture of a man who had no regard for human life. Shockley's cold demeanor during questioning, combined with his failure to offer any explanation for his actions, sent a clear message. He was not a man seeking redemption or understanding. Instead, he was a man who had embraced violence as the only solution to his problems. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Shockley's crime was not an isolated act of passion. It was the culmination of years of hatred and resentment toward the law. His actions were a form of retaliation, a violent response to the perceived injustices he had faced. The more investigators dug into his past, the more they understood that Shockley had been planning this crime for some time. His hatred of law enforcement had consumed him, and killing Sergeant Graham was the final act in his quest for vengeance. The trial of Lance Colin Shockley was a highly emotional event, with the law enforcement community watching closely as justice was sought for the brutal murder of Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham Jr. The case was not only about one man's life, it was about the life of a respected officer, a father, and a member of the community who had given everything to serve others. Throughout the trial, Shockley maintained a defiant attitude. He refused to show any remorse for his actions, and his lack of empathy made him a chilling figure in the courtroom. The prosecution presented a clear case, outlining the events leading up to Sergeant Graham's death, Shockley's motivations, and the chilling coldness with which the crime was committed. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was clear that Shockley had committed murder with premeditation and malice. Shockley's defense team attempted to argue that his actions were a result of mental illness, but the jury was not swayed. The emotional toll of the trial weighed heavily on Sergeant Graham's family, but they remained resolute in their pursuit of justice. They had lost a loved one, and they would not allow Shockley's lack of remorse to deny them closure. In the end, Lance Colin Shockley was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His time on death row was marked by a continued lack of remorse for his actions. Shockley showed no signs of regret, and his refusal to acknowledge the impact of his crime on Sergeant Graham's family only deepened the pain they had already suffered. Shockley's execution was a somber event. It was the culmination of a long journey for Sergeant Graham's family. who had fought for justice since the moment he was taken from them. On the day of his execution, Shockley's final moments were marked by a sense of indifference. His final words were sparse and emotionless, reflecting the callousness that had defined his actions throughout the entire case. For Sergeant Graham's family, Shockley's death brought little comfort. The pain of losing their loved one could never be erased, but they found solace in knowing that Shockley would never harm another officer again. The case served as a reminder of the dangers law enforcement officers face every day and the deep, unhealed wounds caused by violence. The tragic killings of the Luna family by Kenneth Jerf are among the most chilling and senseless acts of violence in recent history. What began as a typical evening for the Luna family ended in unspeakable horror. The brutality with which Jerf executed his victims, along with his disturbing motivations, sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community in Arizona. His violent spree didn't just devastate a single family, it sent ripples through the entire state. This case stands as a grim reminder of how the dark recesses of the human mind can drive someone to commit heinous acts without any apparent motive other than a desire for destruction. Jerf's crime spree started on a quiet evening when he brutally attacked the Luna family, a family that had no known connection to him. He arrived at their home, unannounced and without warning. Jerf's actions were calculated and cold. He used a variety of weapons to carry out the murders, ensuring there was no chance of survival for the victims. The horror of the attack was not just in the violent nature of the murders, but in the shock that a person could be so detached from humanity as to perpetrate such a crime. This was not a crime of passion or anger, it was an execution. The victims had been ambushed in their own home, a place that should have been a sanctuary for them. As the details of the crime unfolded, investigators were horrified by the level of brutality Jerf had shown. But what was even more unsettling was the lack of any clear motive. Jerf's reasons for carrying out such a violent act were not immediately clear. There was no personal connection to the family, no known dispute, and no apparent cause for the attack. This created a chilling mystery for law enforcement. Why had Jerf chosen this family? Why had he killed them with such relentless savagery? Kenneth Jerf's life was a series of troubled experiences, but none of them seemed to provide an explanation for the extreme violence he was capable of. He had a history of criminal behavior, but his offenses had always been relatively minor until the day he killed the Luna family. Jerf's personal history was filled with signs of deep-seated psychological issues. He had an obsession with violent films, particularly those that glorified murder and chaos. These films seemed to fuel his delusions and warped view of the world. It was as if Jerf viewed violence as a form of entertainment or an escape from his own miserable existence. His obsession with these films took a sinister turn when he began to see them as models for his own life. The constant exposure to brutality and carnage seemed to blur the lines between fiction and reality for Jerf. This psychological breakdown was compounded by a history of social isolation and a deep resentment toward the world around him. Jerf's past was one of failed relationships and an inability to form meaningful connections with others. His isolation made him increasingly unstable, and his obsession with violent films became his sole outlet for his frustrations. There were no known indicators that Jerf would commit such extreme acts of violence, but his state of mind was fragile. He was consumed by a desire to experience the same level of chaos and destruction that he had seen in the films he idolized. Jerf's psychological profile painted a clear picture. He was a man who had completely disconnected from reality, using violence as a means to find meaning in an otherwise empty life. The investigation into the Luna family murders was complex and emotionally taxing for law enforcement. Detectives and officers from all over Arizona were brought in to solve the case, but they were faced with a difficult challenge. There were no clear motives, no obvious suspects, and no leads to follow. At first, the case appeared to be a random act of violence, an attack by a person who had no connection to the victims. The first breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Jerf had been obsessed with violent media, and his background showed signs of a troubled mind. They found traces of Jerf's online activity, including messages and forums where he had expressed admiration for violent films. Jerf had made disturbing statements that suggested he had planned to carry out violent acts, but they were not immediately taken seriously. It wasn't until after the murders that investigators realized the gravity of his obsession. As the investigation continued, law enforcement officials began to piece together the timeline of Jerf's actions. They found that Jerf had stalked the Luna family for days before the murders, carefully planning his attack. Jerf had taken steps to ensure that he would not be caught. He had gone to great lengths to remove any evidence that could link him to the crime. However, his actions were not without mistakes. A crucial piece of evidence came when investigators discovered surveillance footage from a nearby business that showed Jerf near the Luna family's home just before the murders. The footage was clear. Jerf had been in the area, and it provided the first solid lead in the case. This was followed by an eyewitness account from a neighbor who had seen Jerf leaving the house on the night of the murders. With this information, the investigators were able to track Jerf's movements and eventually locate him. As they closed in on him, Jerf was apprehended without resistance. He showed no signs of remorse during his arrest, and when questioned, he gave little explanation for his actions. Jerf's refusal to provide any real motive for the murders left investigators puzzled. His cold, emotionless demeanor only heightened the horror surrounding the crime. This was not the reaction of a man who had committed murder out of anger or revenge. It was as if Jerf had committed the crime as though he was following the script of a film, as if it were just a part of his twisted fantasy. The trial of Richard Kenneth Jerf was a long and emotionally exhausting process for the surviving family members of the Luna family. The evidence against Jerf was overwhelming, and the prosecution made a strong case for the brutality of his crime. Jerf's defense team attempted to argue that he was suffering from a mental illness, but the jury was not swayed. The crime was too calculated, too brutal to be dismissed as the result of a mere mental breakdown. During the trial, Jerf's lack of remorse became one of the key points of contention. He showed no emotion throughout the proceedings, offering no explanation for his actions. His cold indifference to the suffering he had caused made him even more detestable in the eyes of the jury. Jerf's refusal to express any sorrow for the death of the Luna family only reinforced the notion that he was beyond redemption. Jerf was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The emotional toll of the trial was felt deeply by the surviving members of the Luna family, who had lost everything in a senseless act of violence. The case was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of life and how a single act of brutality could destroy everything. Jerf's cold, emotionless personality made the crime even more horrifying, as it became clear that he had no regard for the lives he had taken. In the years following his conviction, Jerf spent time on death row, but his behavior did not change. He remained indifferent to the suffering he had caused and showed no remorse for his actions. As his execution date approached, there were no final words of regret or sorrow from Jerf. His death was as cold and detached as the crime he had committed. The execution of Richard Kenneth Jerf brought some closure to the Luna family, but it did not heal the wounds left by his brutal act of violence. His death was a grim reminder of the consequences of unchecked anger and the dangers of living in a world that glorifies violence. Jerf's story ended in a way that many had hoped for, but it could never erase the devastation he had caused. The case of Richard Kenneth Jerf was one of senseless violence and psychological breakdown. His actions were not motivated by anger, revenge, or personal gain. Instead, they were driven by an obsession with violence and a twisted desire to turn real life into the brutal narratives he had seen in films. The Luna family's tragedy was one of the darkest chapters in Arizona's criminal history, a reminder of how a troubled mind can destroy innocent lives. The emotional aftermath of Jerf's actions left a lasting impact on everyone involved, and his execution, while bringing some justice, could never undo the damage he had caused. We've walked through 4 harrowing cases today, each one revealing a story of unspeakable violence, chilling motivations, and the search for justice. From the brutal crime committed by Roy Lee Ward, which shattered the lives of Stacey Payne's family, to the deeply unsettling double murder by Samuel Lee Smithers, who led a twisted double life as a deacon, these stories have not only shocked us, but left us questioning the depths of human nature. Lance Colin Shockley's cold-blooded murder of Sergeant Carl Dwayne Graham Jr. showed the dangerous impact of hatred toward authority, while Richard Kenneth Jerf's senseless killing spree, driven by his obsession with violent films, highlighted the unsettling effect that media can have on an unstable mind. Each case exemplifies not just the brutality of the acts themselves, but the psychological profiles of those who committed them, individuals who crossed a line from ordinary to monstrous. The emotional toll on the victims' families and the communities left behind is staggering, and it's something that no amount of justice can truly repair. But the question remains, how do we reconcile these horrific crimes with the concept of justice? Were the executions of these criminals justified, or does our justice system sometimes fail to deliver true retribution? Each case has left us with lingering questions, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe in the death penalty for such crimes? Or should there be a different approach to dealing with individuals like these? How do you feel about the role psychological factors play in these decisions? Please share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. We're eager to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into these shocking true crime cases, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you more of these intense, thought-provoking stories. Don't forget to share this video with others who might find it as captivating as you did. And stay tuned because in our next episode, we'll take a closer look at some of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.